black woman walks into an upscale restaurant expecting a quiet meal. But within moments she's met with hostility from the very man in charge. What happens next will leave an entire room of diners questioning everything they thought they knew. Before we dive in, let us know in the comments, have you ever experienced discrimination in a place of business? Amira Johnson stepped into Crestwood Fine Dining, the kind of establishment where chandeliers dripped from the ceiling and the air smelled of aged wine and old money. She walked with confidence, her heels clicking against the polished marble floor, her black dress hugging her frame with effortless elegance. Heads turned as she passed, but she was used to that. She had worked for everything she had. The boutique investment firm she built from the ground up, hers. The custom jewelry on her wrist, hers. The luxury car she had parked just outside the valet stand, also hers. And tonight, she was going to enjoy a meal at one of the finest restaurants in the city. Or so she thought. The moment she approached the hostess stand, she noticed him. A middle-aged man with neatly combed salt and pepper hair and an expensive watch that seemed to tick a little too loudly. His name tag read, Richard Collins, manager. He stood stiffly, eyes flicking over her as if she'd tracked in something from the street. "Can I help you?" His voice was clipped, polite in a way that was anything but. Amira glanced at the hostess, a younger woman who avoided eye contact. "Yes, I have a reservation under Johnson, 8 o'clock. Richard didn't check the system, didn't ask for clarification. He simply folded his arms and exhaled sharply. "Sorry, but we're fully booked tonight." Amira blinked. "That's strange. I made my reservation a week ago. I even received a confirmation earlier today." "We must have been overbooked," he said, still making no effort to verify. Amira tilted her head, studying him. The room around them was filled with well-dressed diners, mostly white, their tables adorned with plates of filet mignon and seared scallops. In the far corner, a group of 4 had just been seated, menus handed to them with warm smiles. "That's interesting," Amira said, her voice calm, measured. "Because I see an open table right there." She motioned to the two-top by the window, its white linen, pristine, untouched. Richard's expression tightened. "That one's reserved." "So, you are taking reservations?" His jaw flexed. The hostess shifted uncomfortably. Amira knew the game. She had played it too many times before, been on the receiving end of these subtle little mistakes that never seemed to happen to anyone else. But she wasn't about to back down. "May I speak to the owner?" she asked, still keeping her composure. Richard smirked. "I handle all customer concerns." "I'm sure you do. But I'd still like to speak with them." His patience was wearing thin. "Miss, we reserve the right to refuse service." Amira's lips parted slightly in disbelief. There it was, the quiet part said out loud. Her fingers curled around her clutch. She could feel the weight of her phone inside. A quick search would pull up the restaurant's policies, reviews, even the owner's name. But she didn't need to, not yet. Because at that moment a waiter, young, nervous, hurried over with an apologetic look. "Miss Johnson?" His voice was uncertain, but he was trying. "Your table is ready, right this way." Richard's entire body tensed. The way his eyes darted toward the waiter, the slight tightening of his grip on the hostess stand. It was the look of someone who had just lost control. Amira held his gaze for a moment longer before offering the faintest of smiles. "Not today." She turned and followed the waiter toward the open table, feeling the tension crackle in the air behind her. She could hear Richard's sharp inhale, the sound of him swallowing whatever words were threatening to spill from his lips. As she took her seat, she noticed something else. The room was watching. A couple near the entrance whispered to one another, eyes flicking in her direction. A waiter standing by the kitchen doors stole a glance, his brows pinched with unease. Even the bartender, polishing a glass behind the counter, seemed to be paying attention. She exhaled, smoothing the napkin across her lap. The thing about racism, the kind that hides behind dress codes and reservation lists, is that it thrives on silence, on the assumption that people like her will accept the lie, step aside, walk away. But Amira Johnson had never been the type to walk away. And tonight she was going to make sure everyone in this restaurant understood exactly why. Amira sat at her table, back straight, fingers tracing the edge of the water glass in front of her. The waiter, a young man named Jordan, his name tag was slightly askew, stood hesitantly beside her, shifting his weight from foot to foot. She could feel his nervous energy, the way his eyes flickered toward the manager across the room, as if expecting Richard Collins to come storming over at any second. "Can I get you started with something to drink?" Jordan asked, voice barely above a whisper. "Just water for now," Amira said, her tone even. "I'd like a wine menu too." Jordan nodded, fumbling slightly as he set a menu on the table. "Of course, I'll be right back with that." As he walked away, Amira let her gaze wander across the restaurant. The soft clinking of silverware, the low hum of conversation. It was a refined atmosphere, designed to make patrons feel important. But she could feel the eyes on her. Subtle glances, murmurs just barely audible over the soft classical music playing through hidden speakers. Some diners avoided looking at her altogether, choosing instead to feign interest in their plates. Others weren't so discreet. 2 tables over, a middle-aged couple exchanged hushed words. The woman, a thin blonde with pearl earrings, turned her nose up slightly, her expression a mix of curiosity and irritation. Her husband, dressed in a tailored navy suit, shook his head. Amira caught the words, "Not the usual clientele," before he took a sip of his scotch. She let it roll off her. She had been here before. Not in this exact restaurant, but in places just like it, the kind that prided themselves on being exclusive, without ever needing to say exactly who they were excluding. Jordan returned quickly, placing a crystal glass of water in front of her and sliding the wine menu onto the table. His hands trembled slightly. She wondered how long he had worked here, how many times he had seen something like this play out. "Do you have any recommendations?" Amira asked, breaking the tension. Jordan blinked, caught off guard. Yes, actually. If you like reds, the Chateau Margaux is excellent. A bit pricey, but very smooth." She smiled. "That sounds perfect. I'll have a glass." Jordan hesitated, glancing once more toward the manager before nodding. "Right away." As he walked toward the bar, Amira felt the shift before she even turned her head. The presence of someone standing too close. The weight of unwanted attention pressing down on her like an invisible hand. "Excuse me," Richard's voice cut through the air, smooth but laced with something sharp beneath the surface. "May I have a word?" Amira took a slow sip of her water before meeting his gaze. "I'm in the middle of dinner." "This won't take long." His smile was tight, forced. She exhaled, setting her glass down. "By all means." Richard leaned slightly toward the table, lowering his voice. "I want to make sure you understand that our restaurant has a certain atmosphere to maintain. Our clientele expects a certain level of service," Amira interjected, arching a brow. "Yes," he said quickly, missing or ignoring the bite in her tone. "And I wouldn't want you to feel uncomfortable." "Uncomfortable?" She tilted her head slightly. "Because I'm dining here? Or because you don't want me here?" Richard's jaw tensed. "That's not what I'm saying." "No?" She folded her hands in her lap, studying him. "Because it sounds a lot like you're trying to push me out without actually saying it. Let me guess. You're suddenly out of the wine I just ordered? Or maybe my table is needed for a special guest?" His face darkened. "I think it would be best if you—" "I think," Amira cut in, her voice steady but firm, "that you should be very careful about what you say next." The space between them crackled with tension. She could see the war waging behind his eyes, the desperate attempt to maintain control of a situation that had already slipped through his fingers. Then, a voice cut through the room. "Excuse me," a woman at the neighboring table said, loud enough for heads to turn. "Is there a problem here?" Amira glanced over. It was the woman in the pearl earrings, the same one who had been whispering to her husband moments ago, except now her expression had shifted. There was something wary in her eyes, something that hinted at unease. "No problem at all," Amira replied smoothly. "Just having a discussion with the manager." The woman pursed her lips but said nothing else. Across the room, Jordan reappeared with a glass of red wine in hand, his posture stiff, his eyes darting between Amira and Richard. He hesitated for a second too long before finally placing the drink down. Richard stepped back, his expression unreadable. "Enjoy your meal." Amira picked up the wineglass, swirling it lightly before taking a sip. Smooth, just as Jordan had promised. She smiled. "I will." Richard walked away, his shoulders rigid, his grip tight around the notepad he hadn't even bothered to write anything on. The moment he disappeared into the back, the energy in the room shifted again. Conversations resumed, silverware clinked against plates, but the undercurrent of curiosity, of tension, remained. Amira could feel it thrumming through the air. Jordan lingered, hands clasped in front of him. I... He cleared his throat. "Let me know if you need anything else." "Thank you, Jordan," she said sincerely. He nodded and quickly retreated. Amira took another sip of her wine, letting it settle on her tongue before swallowing. She was in no rush. She was going to take her time. Let them watch, let them whisper. She had a right to be here. And she wasn't going anywhere. Amira let the taste of the wine linger before placing her glass down with deliberate care. She could feel the weight of the moment settling over the restaurant like a thick blanket. But she wasn't the one suffocating under it. Richard was. She knew his type. Men who operated on quiet exclusion, their power resting in the unspoken rules that dictated who belonged and who didn't. And when those rules failed, when someone like her refused to step aside, that was when they unraveled. She picked up the menu, reading it as if she had all the time in the world. The manager was gone, but she knew better than to think he had truly walked away. He was watching, seething, probably pacing in the back, trying to figure out how to get her out without making a scene he couldn't control. But him. Jordan returned, standing stiffly beside her table. His voice was careful, too careful. "Have you decided on your entree, Ms. Johnson?" She tapped her finger lightly on the menu. "The filet, medium rare, and I'll take the truffle mashed potatoes on the side." Jordan nodded, scribbling it down. "Would you like any appetizers to start?" "The lobster bisque," she said, glancing up at him, "and another glass of this wine." He hesitated, not for long, but enough that she noticed. "Of course," he said quickly before hurrying off. She followed him with her eyes, her expression neutral. The air around her hummed with discomfort, the kind that came when people realized something wasn't right but weren't sure if they should say anything. Most wouldn't. Most would pretend not to notice. Amira had no such luxury. A few tables over, the man in the navy suit cleared his throat, shifting in his seat. The woman in pearls tapped her nails against the stem of her glass, her discomfort painted across her face. Amira knew what they were thinking. Why not just leave? Why push? Why make it uncomfortable for everyone? She smiled to herself. Just a little. Because comfort was a privilege, and she was done making herself smaller for the sake of it. A voice broke the uneasy quiet. "You handled that well." She turned her head slightly, finding the older man at the table beside hers, watching her with mild amusement. He was well-dressed, his suit a deep charcoal, the kind of cut that spoke of quiet wealth. He had an air of someone used to being listened to, his posture relaxed, but his eyes sharp. She lifted a brow. "Handled what?" He chuckled. You know what? She took a slow sip of her wine. I wasn't aware I needed to handle anything. His smile widened slightly, but there was curiosity behind it. Most people would have left. She met his gaze evenly. Most people aren't me. The amusement in his expression deepened, but he didn't press further. Instead, he picked up his own glass, tipping it toward her slightly before taking a sip. Her food arrived not long after. Jordan placed each dish down with practiced precision, though she caught the slight tremor in his hands. She almost felt bad for him. Almost. But Jordan had made his choice, just as she had made hers. As she cut into her fillet, she felt the presence before she saw him. Richard had returned, his steps measured, his hands clasped behind his back as he approached her table. Is everything to your liking? His voice was smooth but forced. She chewed slowly, savoring the taste before swallowing. It's excellent. He nodded stiffly. Good. She waited. He wasn't here for pleasantries. He wanted something. Richard took a breath, his nostrils flaring slightly. I do hope you understand that we have certain standards here at Crestwood. Our policies. Your policies, she interrupted, setting her knife down neatly. You mean the one where you refuse to seat paying customers based on nothing but your own bias? A hush rippled through the nearby tables. Not loud, not obvious, but it was there. His jaw tightened. I assure you, that's not what happened. No. She tilted her head slightly. Because it seems to me that I had a reservation. I arrived on time, yet somehow you still told me you were full. A flicker of frustration crossed his face, barely concealed. It was a misunderstanding. She let the silence stretch just long enough. No, it wasn't. Richard's patience was slipping. His grip on control was faltering, and he knew it. I have the right to refuse service to anyone, he said, his voice lowering. She smiled. And I have the right to make sure that everyone knows why. His lips parted slightly, and for the first time there was real unease behind his eyes. That was what men like Richard feared most. Not the confrontation, not the tension, but the exposure. The moment their carefully constructed facade cracked, the moment people started watching. And right now, the entire restaurant was watching. Her phone sat beside her plate, face up. She hadn't recorded anything. She hadn't even touched it. But the implication of it alone was enough. Richard exhaled sharply. Enjoy your meal. She lifted her glass. I intend to. He turned on his heel, walking away with stiff, measured steps. And just like that, the power shifted. She felt it in the air, in the way conversations picked up again, though the glances lingered longer now. She wasn't just the black woman who had been denied a table. She was the black woman who had refused to be denied. She finished her meal at her own pace. When Jordan returned with the check, she slid her card across the table without hesitation. He took it with careful hands, disappearing for only a moment before returning. She glanced at the receipt, her lips curling slightly at the automatic gratuity added to her bill. Petty. She took the pen, scribbling a very generous tip for Jordan anyway, along with a single word at the bottom of the receipt. Do better. She stood, sliding her clutch under her arm, and turned toward the entrance. As she walked, she caught a glimpse of Richard near the bar, his face pinched, his fingers gripping a tumbler of whiskey like it might shatter in his grasp. She let the door swing open, stepping into the night air. Let him seethe. She had already won. Amira stepped outside, the cool night air washing over her as she adjusted her clutch under her arm. The tension of the evening should have settled by now, but she could still feel it crackling behind her, as if the weight of what had just happened inside Crestwood Fine Dining had seeped into the very foundation of the restaurant. She turned slightly, glancing through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Richard Collins was still at the bar, his face tight, his fingers wrapped around his drink as if he could squeeze control back into his grasp. She exhaled slowly and smiled to herself. It wasn't just about a table. It never was. It was about power. Who was given it? Who was expected to shrink beneath it? And who decided, finally, that they weren't playing by those unspoken rules anymore? She pulled out her phone and checked the time. A part of her considered leaving it at that, walking away, knowing she had made a point loud enough to shake the walls of that restaurant. But something inside her told her that wasn't enough. Not this time. She tapped her screen a few times, pulling up a number before bringing the phone to her ear. "Good evening, Mr. Walker," she said smoothly when the line picked up. "I assume you're aware of the reputation your restaurant has just gained tonight." There was a long pause before a voice, deep and measured, responded. "Ms. Johnson, to what do I owe this call?" Amira could hear the tension, the controlled urgency of a man who already had a sinking suspicion about why she was reaching out. "It seems your manager, Richard Collins, believes he runs this restaurant without consequence," she said, walking toward her car at a leisurely pace. "And tonight he made a rather unfortunate mistake." "Tell me what happened," Mr. Walker said, his voice sharpening. She didn't have to. She knew the moment she stepped outside, the restaurant's name was already making rounds on social media. People in that dining room had witnessed what happened, and she had no doubt at least one of them had begun whispering the details to the right ears. A scandal was brewing, and it wouldn't stay contained behind those gold-plated doors for long. She had their backup, and now she needed tips from users. She took her time, recounting the night's events in crisp detail. The refusal of service, the veiled excuses, the blatant dismissal, and the final attempt to intimidate her into silence. She laid it all out, calmly and without hesitation, allowing the weight of her words to settle like stones in the man's ear. When she was finished, there was another long pause. "It's unacceptable," Mr. Walker said finally, though his voice now carried something deeper than just discomfort. It carried fear. "Yes," Amira agreed. "It is." Another silence. Then, the sound of a sharp exhale. "You're not going to keep this quiet, are you?" Amira let out a light laugh. "Would you?" Walker didn't answer right away, but she could feel his mind racing through the phone. This wasn't just a simple misunderstanding. It wasn't just a poor interaction with a difficult customer. This was the kind of thing that ruined reputations, destroyed businesses, turned upscale fine dining establishments into ghost towns overnight. "You should know," Walker said after a long moment. "Richard Collins is not an owner. He is an employee." "An employee who clearly believes he's untouchable," Amira pointed out. Walker was quiet for a moment longer before he finally spoke. "Consider this handled, Miss Johnson." She smiled. "I will." She ended the call, slipping her phone back into her bag as she reached her car. The valet, a young man in a neatly pressed uniform, had been watching her, his expression unreadable. "Would you like me to bring your car around, ma'am?" he asked cautiously. She nodded, handing him her ticket. As he jogged off toward the parking area, she turned back toward the restaurant one last time. Through the glass, she saw Richard still at the bar, oblivious to the fact that his world was about to shatter. It wasn't just about what had happened tonight. It was about every night before this one, every customer he had quietly pushed out, every slight he had justified under the guise of maintaining the restaurant's atmosphere. He had operated under the assumption that the people he dismissed would never push back hard enough to matter. He was wrong. The valet returned moments later, pulling up in front of her sleek black car. He stepped out, nodding as he handed her the keys. She reached into her clutch and pulled out a crisp bill, pressing it into his palm. "Thank you," she said, her voice warm. His eyes flicked toward the restaurant before he looked back at her. His expression softened just slightly. "Drive safe, ma'am." She slid into the driver's seat, adjusting the mirrors before starting the engine. The hum of the car was steady, grounding. She took a moment, letting the night settle over her before pulling away from the curb. The restaurant faded into the distance behind her. By morning, the headlines would spread. The fallout would begin, and Richard Collins would finally learn what it meant to be unwelcome.